person seized or held as security for the fulfillment of a condition. Welcome back, everyone. And today we're going to be talking about what is probably behavior's most hypocritical position on their own game. Well, multiple hypocritical positions, really, but they're really all related to the same thing: holding the game hostage. This is a subject matter that I touched on a while back while discussing actions of killer entitlement. And oh boy, did I get dumped on hard by people who could not have been turning themselves more into knots with mental gymnastics, or by referencing the dev's own mental gymnastics in the face of a simple point of fact. Slugging for 4 kills is an act of entitlement and is also holding the game hostage. Now, this matter is not arguable from a practical standpoint, but behavior wants us to believe that up is down and black is white when it comes to this subject. Now, it's not just exclusive to this specific situation, but we'll touch upon that later. And moreover, in this discussion, I will be using the words of an existing behavior developer and admin to demonstrate just how ridiculous behavior's own position is on the matter. So you won't have to take it from me. You can take it from them yourselves. I will also be discussing easy solutions to the problem that in Dead by Daylight's long 7 years, the devs should have thought up themselves, if they were already not suggested to them by many of the current and former players. The first thing I believe needs to be said here is that it should be common sense that by no means, in any game, should the side that is winning be allowed to have full control over when the end of the game begins. I've said this before, and I will say it again and again. The reason for this is because the side of a game that is clearly dominating has zero incentive to set that end of game in motion. This is because that side has either the resources or the time available to cause delay of the end of game so as to not only have beaten the other side, but crushed them entirely. It is at this point the side who is winning is not even concerned about their own victory. They're rather concerned with just total domination, which itself is very unsportsmanlike. It's basically the concept of the sore winner. When a game is only over because the winner says it's over, that is a game that is catering to bullies and sadists. This not only breeds toxic behavior, but is also not conducive to an environment of healthy competition. For those of you who don't see this as a problem, one only needs to look at games like Ark Survival Evolved and their public PvP servers, in which players who dominated public servers would engage and enforce in-game and even across servers. So if you tried to escape it, you couldn't. But they would enforce in-game slavery on other players. And this is just to set a clear example of why this design feature doesn't belong in gaming. There is no other fathomable purpose for such a feature except for intentionally encouraging players to be their absolute worst and to normalize toxic behaviors within your player base. According to behavior's own rules, it's a perfectly legitimate form of gameplay for a killer to lock down a 3-gen and slug everyone, one at a time, until bleeding everyone out, without ever attempting to hook a single survivor. Nope, nothing wrong with this at all. Even though, for all intents and purposes, this killer is holding the game hostage, so long as there is at least one person actively bleeding out, the game is still, quote, making progress. Even if the killer doing this drags this on for 20 or 30 minutes, it's an entirely legitimate way to play the game, well, except when it isn't. But again, this isn't according to me, this is according to behavior. Now, most people with good sense, and even most people within the DBD community, would agree that the example I gave would be a clear example of holding a game hostage, even though there are timers in the form of bleeding out. However, it's really only the DBD community who would then argue that this is not the same as slugging to get 4 kills. As a warning, this is where the cringeworthy mental gymnastics really begins. Now, many of you are familiar with how this game is played, but for newer players, let's explain how at least the end game essentially works. Currently, in Dead by Daylight, when there is only one survivor player left, a hatch spawns, giving both the survivor and the killer an opportunity to race to the hatch to either escape or close the hatch, starting the timer for the endgame collapse. If the killer reaches the hatch and triggers the endgame collapse, all of the generators will be blocked and the doors will be powered, giving the survivor one last chance to escape. This escape is often much harder than the hatch since it is entirely dependent on how close the two gates spawn to each other, and whether or not the last survivor can successfully spend 20 seconds opening a gate and then make it all the way to the exit before the killer catches them or time runs out. So, what happens when there are two survivors remaining? This is the main crux of the issue. Under the circumstances of normal gameplay, if one of those survivors is caught by the killer and placed on a hook, they have up to 2 minutes to hang there for the other survivor to rescue them. Or, alternatively, if the survivors don't have a reasonable chance to finish the generators and escape, the hooked survivor can choose to give up on hook to shorten the amount of time it takes for them to die so that the last survivor has a better chance of escaping, or they can decide to sandbag the last survivor by holding on for as long as possible. Now contrast this with being slugged by the killer instead of being put on a hook. Slugging, of course, being the practice of a killer downing a survivor then leaving them on the ground, like a slug. The slugged survivor can only wait there, or move around the map, but really they can only wait down on the ground for up to 4 minutes until they fully bleed out or are picked up by the last survivor. In this situation, they're stripped of any agency they have outside of disconnecting, which of course they'll be punished for. In this instance, both survivors are in fact being held hostage until the killer player gets to have fulfillment of them getting all 4 kills. And the worst part is, behavior facilitates this through the disconnect penalty. But moving on, this is quite literally the killer saying to the slugged survivor, "You're going to sit here, unable to play the game until I find and kill the other survivor, and then I'm going to return to kill you unless you disconnect." I mean, this is an ultimatum. And when are ultimatums typically used? That's right, hostage situations. Of course, to the survivor who's not slugged, it's essentially the killer saying, "I'm going to make this person sit here for 4 minutes doing nothing unless you let me kill you." Again, this is an ultimatum. Because more often than not, a killer is going to have the survivors in a situation where it's not reasonable for the survivors to attempt to do generators, or even if they go and make a rescue, they're just going to get slugged again and again and again, or back and forth, just being slugged over and over again until the killer gets their way. The survivors they have no meaningful way of making any progress outside of bleeding. So when you think about it, this is a really messed up situation. And it's not even that it's the game being held hostage. This is a literal hostage situation. Granted, nobody's actually getting hurt. It's an inconvenience, it's an annoyance. It's really no different than hackers who grab streamers and bring them up to the top of the world and have to make them wait out for whatever period of time they decide to make them wait out. I mean, granted, yes, it's 4 minutes, but with how long this process can drag out, I've seen games that were over in 5 minutes and they were dragged out an additional 10 minutes just because the killer wanted that 4K, that 4 kills. Absolutely dragged out. The survivors did not have a chance to actually meaningfully escape. That's all this killer did, was hold them hostage for 10 minutes until they got the candy they were stamping their feet on the ground for. The worst part about this hostage taking in Dead by Daylight is that not only are killer players rewarded for it by getting bonus points and, being able to control the end game and being able to do this and inflict this on others, but they are actually empowered by behavior to do this. It's literally a policy by the devs that by design encourages players to grief survivors when given the opportunity, and for no other reason than because they can. Is it any wonder why people call this game a bully simulator? I mean, really, stop and think of it. Now, this characterization of the situation might come across as grim or even hyperbolic, but that is the reality of it. The killer wins the game at 3 kills, so at this point, slugging to get 4 kills is just making victims of the last 2 survivors. And for what end? And I know some of you may be scoffing at the idea, but consider that, again, at 3 kills, the killer has already won the game. So why is there a need to force another player to sit there for 4 minutes, or even longer, just so that the killer can kill all 4 survivors without any resistance? Tell me, what kind of good player can't just accept winning a match, but rather needs to dominate by forcing themselves on others instead of achieving one through skill? This is why the practice is generally considered scummy, because there is no purpose for it beyond being gratuitous for the sake of gratuity. And again, there's no real purpose for it because the killer doesn't earn it, they force it upon the other side, and again, there's no point for it. They've already won. So now let's get into what the devs have to say about this. Oh, and the full forum page is linked in the description down below. So once again, you don't have to take my word for it. Take theirs, the devs. Now, according to Mandy, and I quote, "Blocking someone so that they cannot do anything to progress the game is against game rules." Alright, that's pretty cut and dry. Doesn't get much clearer than that now, doesn't it? Sounds exactly like what I've been talking about. But then, Mandy goes on to say in response to some rather reasonable criticism, "Whilst you might not feel that 4 minutes bleed out is very quick, it's most certainly not indefinite, which is where we draw the definition of hostage taking from, including not being able to progress the game. A survivor being slugged and bleeding out is not indefinite and is progressing the game as the survivor is dying." End quote. Okay, so now we've hit our first major contradiction, which was responded to rather masterfully by someone in the forum. If I don't do gens and hid for the full game, or if the killer traps someone in the corner, it's not indefinite either. The game ends after such a time. So where does the line between hostage and annoyance begin? To which Mandy replies, "The game will end after 1 hour, so it's indefinite up to that period. There's nothing the player can do to progress the game, which is where the hostage situation comes into it." Oh man, where do we begin? I can think of dozens of ways outside of trapping a survivor in a corner or hiding all game in which we can reach the full 1 hour time limit. I mean, 3 gens. 3 gens are hard baked into the game, and in fact, into every map. A 3 gen is hard baked into every single map, and all you need is the right killer on that map, oftentimes on multiple maps, but still all you need is the right killer, and you can hold a 3 gen indefinitely. But is that holding the game hostage? Is not being able to make progress on the gens holding the game hostage? Who's holding the game hostage in that situation? You see the absurdity of this whole thing. It's just there. It's frustrating how frankly stupid. And I'm not meaning this as an attack on Mandy, but how stupid the answer she gave was. There is a very good question raised, and all she could do is just contradict herself. So, as you all can see, Mandy is responding to the contradiction being pointed out with another contradiction. So, if we're thinking like a behavior developer, holding the game hostage can best be described as blocking a player so they cannot progress the game. But since players can progress the game passively, reaching a passive ending is progressing the game, except when it isn't, because reasons. The definition doesn't make any sense at all, and not only fully contradicts itself, but what about one of the more important elements of this conversation? We're very often talking about the survivor who is slugged and their experience. We're not often talking about the survivor who's left standing, and why this is probably the bigger side of the problem, and is that the definition that behavior uses completely eliminates one survivor from any consideration in this circumstance, just referring instead to the survivor who's on the ground. Because even though the survivor on the ground is progressing the game, the survivor who's standing is not able to progress the game. And this is especially true if there's multiple generators that need to be completed. So they're completely unable to progress the game because of the killer's actions, which is, by behavior's own definition, holding the game hostage. So according to behavior, slugging for a 4K is holding the game hostage, even though according to behavior, slugging for a 4K is not holding the game hostage. It's seriously, behavior, get off the fence. Get your ass off the fence. Like, at this point, you're inseparable from it. This is a very clear problem. And the problem with the dev's definition is that in order for it to work, there can be no other survivors in the game. But the problem with their definition is that it's applied only to one survivor who's in the game with at least one other survivor. Oftentimes, just one other survivor. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were the head of a game developing studio, I would think the response given by Mandy was a very lazy response to a problem that demonstrably has a negative effect on a game's player base, which therefore can also translate into fewer dollars spent by those very players, or worse, an inability to retain players. Something that behavior has seen some trouble with over the past few years. This sort of cavalier attitude towards an obvious problem with player conduct is nothing more than an astounding display of arrogance, as if they believe nothing will ever bring them down. Needless to say, if I were in charge, someone would either be in my office for a chat or cleaning out their own to make room for devs with the sense to fix easy and obvious problems in a live service game. Now we've reached the part of the video where I will discuss solutions, both long-term and short-term, to the problem. The first and easiest solution is to simply disable the disconnection penalty. This is something behavior could do overnight, and yes, this will also enable all sorts of other undesired behavior. What it won't do is make behavior directly complicit with ruining the game for multiple survivors. It will also give slugged survivors agency over whether to sit there for 4 minutes or to simply leave. I know some people are slamming away at their keys, typing out some sort of response about people rage quitting, and those people would have already disconnected or killed themselves on hook anyway. It's not rewarding rage quitting, it's choosing not to punish people who are being held hostage for a set period of time. The second and better solution would be to take control over the endgame away from the side that's winning. This means making it so the hatch spawns when there's one survivor left standing, not alive, and that the killer is no longer allowed to close hatch. But the hatch will close after one survivor escapes. Along with this, making it so endgame collapse starts when the gates are powered for any reason. This way, survivors cannot endlessly swap hooks until they force their desired outcome either. No more 99ing a door, which defeats the purpose of even having an endgame collapse in the first place. Furthermore, I would not allow the timer to slow down. Keep it a flat 2 minutes or make it a flat 3 minutes. None of this fluctuating timer nonsense. The whole purpose of the endgame collapse is to force survivors out, and this is the best solution as it stops both killers and survivors from needlessly delaying the game for purposes of achieving total domination over the other side because they weren't able to do it within the confines of normal gameplay. The third solution would be to allow survivors to pick themselves up out of the dying state. Of course, this would need numerous conditions to make sure that it couldn't be abused and various triggers, and we all know how well behavior can do just about anything. I mean, oh god, they could run an update that has literally no changes to the game other than adding a single killer, and the whole game just falls apart. I mean, do you really trust them to make conditions that work properly for something of this nature? But outside of that, you'd have to find a way to prevent it from being abusable by either side, and then when you were actually able to implement it, you'd then have to go over and rework all sorts of perks. Then you'd have to rework all sorts of challenges in the in the rifts and the tomes and whatnot. All old challenges would have to get completely reworked. Perks, achievements might have to get reworked. It's far more hassle than it's worth. It sounds like it's the simpler solution, but in the end, it's really not. Now, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a fair amount of killer players who are going to get salty over this video, much like they got salty over the last time I discussed this subject. But just bear with me. Stop and think about it from a business perspective. It's excessive at best and abusive at worst. There's nothing fun about it. It creates a negative experience for new and existing players. It provides little to no value for the player causing the specific example of holding a game hostage, and is completely unfun for the people being subjected to it. With these things in mind, there really isn't any reason why behavior shouldn't do anything about it. Unless, of course, their intention really is to create a toxic community who delights in bullying and crushing the people they play with, rather than having fun matches and enjoying a fun game. There's nothing wrong with playing hard, or even killing all 4 survivors. But when you have to hold the game hostage, even for a limited time, to force something you didn't earn on other players, after you've already won the game, you're just being a douche to be a douche. Of course, this is with the exception of adepts or current challenges, but this is not me being hypocritical. Rather, it's because of conditions set by behavior. It's them being unreasonable. And it only further encourages and rewards this behavior. I personally don't approve of it, even though I've had to do it just to accomplish getting achievements or challenges. That is something that is 100% within behavior's own control to fix. They are the ones who set these conditions, who encourage this type of scummy play, and to what end? I don't believe any business wants to push their customers away, which makes it all the more baffling why behavior hasn't done anything to patch, just anything to patch it at all. Anyways, that's going to do it for me, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to leave it here. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. And once again, don't take my word for it. You can take the devs' own words for it. It's linked to the forum specifically where the devs discuss this down below. So, again, you don't have to take my word for it. And be sure, of course, to hit that like button if you do like the video. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you want to see more content like this, or just more gaming content in general. And don't forget to check me out on Twitch or on Twitter. where you can find me there as well. Join the Discord if you want to join the community and come and hang out and play some games with us. Anyways, that'll do it for me. I'm going to see all of you guys in the next video. Bye.